It's a great pleasure to have David Miller with us for our second conversation on urbanization. David and I talked a little bit about things we could talk about, and one of the things I raised as a question that I wanted to understand better was how Toronto ended up with its rectangular street grid, and that led me to do a little bit of digging. And I thought I would just start with a couple of pictures that give some of what I learned about the history here. So, yep. Okay. Yep, there are no cards on the seats, so as questions occur to you during the talk, you can write down questions and pass them to the, do you want to have people pass them?
Around the center at about 5:30.
So pass them to the center, and then we'll take some questions at the end as well. So the first picture is a line drawing by Solly Angel, who works with us here in the Urbanization Project. It's from his terrific book, Planet of Cities. And what it shows is the inordinate distance between the arterial roads in Bangkok. This is the kind of thing that can happen if there's no coordination as land gets subdivided and developed, and you can end up permanently in a situation with many kilometers distance between arterial roads, and that means that it's impossible to have an effective public transport system like a bus system that somebody can walk to within half a kilometer or a kilometer at most from their house, and enough density of these arterials so these buses aren't just overwhelmed with traffic. This is a picture from Google Earth of a different part of Bangkok that just gives you a sense of a 1 kilometer distance and the lack of thoroughfares, arterials, that cross this line. And it's, of course, a huge contrast with Manhattan, where if you draw a 1 kilometer line in Midtown, you see a number of avenues who cross, and if we had one running, the other direction, you'd be crossed by even more streets. Now, I knew the story of how New York got its grid. There was a plan that was backed by the authority of the state legislature in 1811. The 3 commissioners had a surveyor. The surveyor laid out the rectangular grid for Manhattan from about this area right up to 155th Street. And that grid was built out over the course of 100 years. But I know that example is very special. Most cities don't end up with a grid because of some plan that individuals initiate. One surveyor goes out and puts survey markers for all of the intersections in the grid, and a plan that looks ahead even 100 years. As I read about other places where you end up with these grids, I stumbled across a nice photo, which is this. This shows the US-Mexico border around Yuma, Arizona, with the US on the right. You can see that all the agricultural plots are divided up along rectangular lines because of the survey of the Western United States that was undertaken at the time of Thomas Jefferson. On the other side, in Mexico, there had been no rectangular survey when plots were first allocated to individuals. And what's interesting is if you just zoom in, for example, on Yuma, Arizona, you can see that in Yuma, there's a rectangular grid that emerges naturally because of this coordination on the survey grid, which divided up the big plots of land. So no surveyor from the government necessarily planned all of Yuma, at least as far as I know. And the government, when it divided up the land into townships and sections and quarter sections, didn't divide things as finely as city blocks, but the city blocks naturally conformed to the existing survey. Now, if you contrast that with Mexicali, Mexico, which is not too far away on the other side of the Mexican border, you can see the persistent effect of the irregular parcels that were first divided when Mexicali was formed. So its center city is not got the same kind of grid structure. So that then brings me to Toronto, which I know moderately well, but I don't know the history very well. I started with it in Google Earth at intersection, so College and Bathurst. And then if you zoom out, you can see that there's lots of bus stops within half a kilometer for everybody living in this neighborhood. It's not It's not a downtown high-density downtown business area like Midtown Manhattan, but the grid still serves a very important function here. If we zoom out one more level, and you still see these two 1 kilometer lines, you can see that from this neighborhood, you're either a short bus ride or even a not too long of a walk, a shorter walk than people in Bangkok would have had to get to the Bloor Street subway line. So somehow Toronto got a grid, and that grid is now the basis for car traffic, to be sure, but bus traffic and even subway and trolley lines, as we'll hear. If you zoom out on Ontario, you can see that there's some kind of gridded structure that was imposed there, which I take it was because of a survey that was done by the British government before land was transferred to the private sector in Ontario. So these roads, which are some of the main arterial roads in Toronto, extend far north in Ontario and come from a survey like the survey in the United States. And with that, I think what I'll do is just turn it over to David to tell us a little bit more about, given that he inherited a city that had that grid, what kinds of things was he able to do in terms of adding to the density, building out the public transit system, and then we'll just see where the conversation goes from there.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for having me here, and thanks for the welcome, everybody. I do want to acknowledge Jerry Hulton, the president of NYU Poly, who's the reason I'm here. So, here with the permission of, or something. And I looking forward to the conversation. I am sort of intrigued because what I've really just heard is American free market economist comes out in favor of centralized planning. So the heavy hand of the state. It's supposed to be the government folks that are coming out saying how good the results are from centralized planning.
It's just the facts.
Just the facts.
Just reporting the facts.
So I want to just am I allowed to go backwards?
Yeah.
Because this slide struck me as interesting. First of all, people probably know this, but in Canada, there's it's a legal fiction now, but it was a reality originally, that all the land that has not been privatized is owned by the Queen. So we call it the Crown and Her Majesty, in the right of the province of Ontario or in the right of the federal government, still today owns undeveloped land, more in wilderness areas, often in mining areas. But all of this land originally, when Toronto was settled, would have been Crown land, and there was a Governor Simcoe when Toronto was still called York, and we were busy doing naughty things like burning Washington. The pesky Canadians was surveyed, and it was done in a very English way. They're called concessions. I think they're a mile apart, all over Ontario. And you can take roads. Yonge Street, which is in the middle, if that's Bathurst, where Paul marked, Yonge Street is in the more dense area where the subway is. That goes up hundreds of miles, dead straight, with the odd correction for the curvature of the Earth from the original survey. And when Paul and I were talking on the phone, I was talking about all these plans and strategies we were doing in Toronto. We're trying to encourage, for environmental reasons, economic reasons, and actually for social reasons, the city to grow inside rather than the suburbs. In the 70s and 80s, and to some extent the 90s, Toronto really suffered from urban sprawl type development. And we're trying to counteract that. This is our official plan document, which shows where development is supposed to go. And Paul and I were talking about this, and Paul said, well, it's in all these rectangular lots. And it is quite fascinating how supportive of development Toronto is able to be. If you look at this map, the blue areas are for industry and heavy industry, things like that. The green areas are natural spaces, and the orange and brown areas are where we want heavy, intense development to come. And those are places where there is or can be higher order rapid transit. And with one exception, which I'll speak about in a minute, almost all of these roads are on this historic grid pattern that was laid out, I think, in 1811, but don't quote me on that. And if you're on Twitter, don't say that David Miller said the grid was laid out in 1811, because no doubt I've got the date wrong. But it still impacts Toronto's development today and what we're able to do today. So And the exception really is the areas around the railway lines, which were diagonal. So there's a couple of roads. You can see one on the your left that is a development road. It's called Dundas, and it's actually curved. It's sort of an old native trail, trading trail, but it really follows the railway lines. But for the railway lines, we've got this grid pattern. It allows us to densify, allows us to welcome development, huge economic boom, very important environmentally, because you can create a city. The goal of this plan, the official plan of the City of Toronto, is that people should be able to live in this city without having to own a car. And, you know, of course, the model is if you live in Manhattan, although Toronto's not nearly as dense, you don't have to have a car. You can. It's your choice, but you don't have to. And that's also about social equity because, you know, people at the lower end of the income scale, car is a huge obligation for them. If you build a city that's dense like this, you can have everybody welcome there. So how are we doing that?
But before we go on, what are the reds, the red areas?
Those are commercial centers.
Okay.
So the idea, downtown's a big commercial center. The idea is we spread that out. It's completely failed. But,
and how far does the subway go right now, a subway or trolley? Is it just the orange area or?
So there are trolley lines through downtown on all of the brown lines, really. There's King, Queen, Dundas, College. There's 4, east-west. 1 north-south, which is Spadina. The subway goes up the Yonge Street, the brown line. And then there's another one called University, which you can't see on this map very well, that's parallel to it. And then the Bloor line east-west, which is loosely goes from the red area on the left across to the end of the brown area on the right.
Okay, got it. So Bloor is the one that I was looking at. And then the brown line that extends up from the center, the subway runs all the way?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Good.
And you know, Bloor used to be the middle of Toronto. One of Toronto's challenges is it's outgrown its transit system. And if you want to live environmentally sustainably, you have to live around the transit. So now Eglinton, which is sort of the next major brown line up there. One interesting little political thing, you can see that this map has gaps. The brown lines aren't contiguous. The theory behind this is you take the major roads where you can have higher order rapid transit, you make them development zones. In Toronto, there are 44 city councillors and 1 mayor, no political parties. So to get anything through, you need to persuade a majority of councillors. In fact, it's like having 44 political parties, to be honest. And that's only in the morning. After lunch, it's different 44, depending on what they ate. So this plan was passed by my predecessor in the last couple of months of his term. He couldn't get the votes to make some of the areas that should be densified listed as brown areas. So that's why there's gaps. So that, you know, in Paul's point about the impact of the grids, I mean, these were laid out, you know, 300 years ago. This is the bus plan for Toronto. You know, it follows precisely, more or less, except for that one exception near the railway tracks, the lines that were laid out, you know, 300 years ago. And the same thing with our rapid transit plan, which is this. The non-colored lines are the existing subways, to give you some sense. The colored lines are new LRT lines, which will be built down the middle of the road. And they're built to support the official plan. So this is where the development will go around these lines. And they all literally follow this ancient infrastructure, which really, I mean, it's the first time I thought about this when you raised it on the phone, Paul. But what happens today when we're planning for future infrastructure?
Yeah.
How do we get it right? Do we leave it up to the market? You know, do we go over to Russia and get some bureaucrats who are really good at central planning and that's a joke. It didn't seem to really be fully appreciated.
But
we're used to Russian hockey players, not Russian central planners, I guess.
But it is a very important consideration as we go speak to the people in the developing world, because they may be doing enormous expansion of urban areas, and a few things done in advance could have enormous and permanent effects in the quality of development. And what's interesting, Solly was arguing with me about this as I was telling him about all these papers. Part of what he was emphasizing is it's not sort of strong state versus strong market, or, you know, big state, small state, but it's really priority, that there's some collective action that has to come first, some collective decision about we're going to organize ourselves around something like this. And the collective action can have as little force as just saying, you know, here's the survey grid. But as long as that comes first, a lot of things can then happen subsequently along with it. So his point was just it's critical to have some collective action that then organizes everybody, and that come first, because as you were describing, trying to fill in the dense corridors, everything you try and do after the fact is subject to hold up and a few people who try and exercise their veto power to extract some special concession.
Yeah, and I would argue that there's a lot of things you have to get right first. And I think the developing world is fascinating right now because climate change is having a massive impact. In sub-Saharan Africa, you're getting climate refugees flooding into cities, which are being built completely in an unplanned way and an unsustainable way. In places like Jakarta, you're having floods like Hurricane Sandy. Very, very serious issues. So the cities are grappling with, where are people going to live? At the same time, they're grappling with how do we adapt to this increasing severity and frequency of storms? How do we adapt to the migrations? And I think, things like getting your survey right matter enormously. And you're quite right, you don't need a heavy hand there. But you do need, basic things like your transportation infrastructure. I was in LA last week at UCLA. And you can see what happens when you get your transportation infrastructure wrong. It was amazing experience because I don't find this in New York. In New York, when people say that you're going to have a meeting, they're there on time or more or less, and they tell you where the meeting is. In LA, every single conversation with somebody about where to meet was, where are you coming from? Oh dear, that's a long trip. And they talked about having an economic weakness because their banks aren't near their universities where all the ideas and entrepreneurship's happening. And people couldn't meet. Well, if you turn that to a developing city, how do you figure that out? Well, you've got to build a great public transit infrastructure at the beginning. That's what happened in New York City. Water and sewers, this isn't romantic, but matters a lot. And are you going to build old concrete sewers, or are you going to use new environmentally sustainable ways of cleaning your water? And how do you organize people around that? Those are really powerful questions. Yeah. And, we don't know if we're going to get them right now. Yeah. We can only use our best guess.
One of the things that still intrigues me about the grid here in New York City is that when people laid it out in 1811, they had no idea how we would be using it now. But somehow it was flexible enough that as cars, paving, utilities that we buried, fiber optic lines that we buried, as those things came along, having some public space that was accessible throughout the whole city to all of the private land, that gave the public sector enough flexibility to adapt as things evolved. So I think you can think of a kind of a hierarchy where something like deciding how you first cut up the land when you give it to the private sector for development, how you cut it up can have an enormous effect. As part of that decision, I think what land you give to the private sector for development as well will be critically important. So it'll just be crazy to give land that's at risk of flooding within a few decades, or repeated flooding even now. So reserving the public.
That seems to have been done in a lot of places.
and then it is crazy.
Manhattan,
it's crazy to do it because then governments get stuck paying people to rebuild every time the structures get flooded and destroyed by the storms.
There's an interesting issue here about public land, because your insight that 200 years ago people didn't know when they laid out the grid here, didn't know how we're going to be using it is a powerful one. But part of what we don't know is what public uses are we going to have in the future. Yeah. And so when we were redeveloping the Toronto waterfront, and I don't know who knows Toronto very well here, but our waterfront's 43 kilometers. Mm-hmm. The western part was redeveloped in the 70s and is generally felt not to be a success because we have tall condominiums right on the water's edge and people can't access it, and there's also no jobs down there. So people live there but they don't work there. And Jane Jacobs' really powerful contribution is you need people living and working to have vibrancy and a strong local economy. So on the eastern part, which we're now turning from an industrial area to a more mixed use area with people living and working and playing, one of the principles we wanted to get was build the public space first. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to take back the water's edge from these industries and make it for the people. We wanted to build the parks first. And that's what we've done in the part that's already been redeveloped. And you can contrast that, and this is within my lifetime in Toronto. The other area was supposed to have great parks, but they kept selling off the land for development to pay for the parks.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you didn't need to pay for parks anymore. Yeah. And if you think, out 100 years, well, in New York City, green space is pretty important. Well, I don't think New York City could survive without Central Park. No matter how strong its economy, people need the green space, and it's very easy to surrender that public space, and it may not just be for green space.
Yeah. Do you have the clicker?
Yes.
One of the things that Solly has talked about a lot is that you need to not only seize and protect you need to seize and plan for the green space, but you have to protect it as well. So the original plan here in New York called for a very large park down in this part of the city, and it obviously
that's not there.
Obviously didn't get built. So I think the same thing happened as what you described in Toronto, where incrementally it was just so tempting as the development proceeded here from left to right. As that land started to become valuable, the city probably just sold chunks of it off. Now, fortunately, someone, and I don't know this history yet, but I love to figure it out. When it became clear that this was not going to be viable, somebody looked farther north at land which at the moment wasn't too valuable yet, and said, "Okay, well, let's, here's our chance. Let's protect it again." And somehow it stuck that second time. But it's one thing to say, well, this is we're going to focus on the idea that this will be the public space we protect. But then it takes this slightly stronger government to stick to that kind of commitment and not give in to the temptation to just sell it off, or equivalently let squatters in the developing world, once squatters take some of the private land, privatize it de facto by giving it to the squatters.
Yeah, and that's clearly the big challenge in the developing world, and it's a huge conundrum because the land is being developed privately faster than the governments can cope with it. It's not, and one of the challenges I see a need today for green space, and I think smart city governments in the world are starting to see a need for climate resilient places in cities. For example, the fact that we've paved over so much land is a huge problem for the water system. In Toronto's case, we get our fresh water from Lake Ontario. That's where we drink our water. That's also where our storm water goes and where our sewage goes. So we literally drink from the same water our sewage goes into. Isn't all that pleasant to think about first thing in the morning, but they clean it very well. But if you were rebuilding the city now, you'd have really natural systems of cleaning the water. You'd have a lot of green roofs. You would have permeable pavement. And it's very hard once everything's in private hands with private regulation to rebuild a city that way. Yeah. We don't know what the challenge will be 50 years from now. That'll be one of them. And I think it speaks to real caution. And perhaps governments are too cautious already, but you have to be very, very careful. Yeah. And if we were doing New York over again, people would prize that.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That park unbelievably.
So I'm curious about the story of the development. So it's the eastern part, will you be able to create some parks on the lakefront?
Yes. So what we've done, we actually did what I said. We've built a boardwalk along the water. This is east of Bay Street for those who know Toronto on the waterfront. Yeah. There's a sugar plant there, and so we had a public competition. We built the parks first, and the development's coming now.
But so what I was curious about is how did you get that land back? Because usually eminent domain is just impossible to exercise. But was this essentially industrial land or manufacturing sites, port sites that weren't zoned for residential use? So you weren't like taking it out of residential use, and the current users, industrial users, weren't interested. So you didn't face too big a fight when you.
Well, it's really complicated actually.
Okay.
The part of the land's owned by the government.
Okay.
Part of it's owned privately. And so we did a plan that set out that idea, build the public spaces first, build the public transit first, which unfortunately we haven't done. Excuse me. And as always, of course, there's budget crunches. So I'm very worried about whether that will ever happen. But we overlaid that plan over the private land and the public land. And in our world, that becomes a negotiation. You could expropriate, which is our equivalent of eminent domain. The the private land, but that's tough to do and very expensive.
Yeah.
I think the real answer to that is we had to be very smart and also had to compromise.
So could you give, if you were taking some private land from someone, could you give them some extra, like
Density.
building rights and density to compensate? Yeah.
So we had to build a plan that was flexible enough
Yeah.
to allow for that, but also was principled. And it was principled. One of the key principles is jobs. It's not about condominiums per se. So the first two projects are about jobs. One's a company called Chorus, which is one of Canada's major film and television production companies, and it has radio stations and TV production facilities there. Next door is George Brown College, which has a college campus, so you've got life all day. And it's in between two parks, one of which I was going to put a plug in for. It's beside this sugar plant, and it's called Sugar Beach. And it's got this really fine white sand and pink beach umbrellas. And it's great. Except you can't swim in the water because that's where the sewage pipe comes into the harbor. And we haven't yet cleaned that sewage pipe up. It's on its way.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's interesting, you know, if you take this sequencing perspective seriously, what you realize is that there are some things like better treatment of the sewage, the sanitary sewers, that you can retrofit later. It's better if you build it early, but you can do that later. The grid is incredibly difficult to fix later. If you didn't separate your storm sewers from your sanitary sewers, that's really expensive to fix later. That's one of these engineering things that some cities are retrofitting, and it's very expensive.
It's also very difficult to change the nature of your transportation network later. Yeah. I mean, yes, you can build subways, but you know, this light rail network that I had up, loosely speaking, you could build one subway line, or you could build that light rail network around around the city. We're only able to do that because the roads are very wide. Yeah. So we can run light rail down the middle of the road and widen the road a little bit and not lose car capacity, which there's a transportation debate about, but there isn't a political debate about. Right? The car drivers still want to be able to drive. And we're able to do that because the original grid. That's good. If you hadn't built subways there, you're looking at 100 years. That would take you 100 years to do that. Yeah. And so I think, Paul, you know, if you're looking at developing cities, you know, the advice to give them, I think, A, you've got to get your grid right quickly. And you know, maybe you survey the grid even in the areas where the informal settlements are coming, just so it starts from that. B, you've got to get the transportation infrastructure and the public infrastructure, I think, like green space there from the very beginning. Yeah. Otherwise, it never happens.
Yeah. I'll tell you a story that Solly has told me that's fascinating, because you mentioned this issue of the informal settlement. In Peru, as in many Latin American countries, there's a somewhat organized process whereby people will just seize land as squatters, and then de facto the government always transfers ownership to the people once they become the squatters. But in many places that happens just in an individual basis, so there's no coordination. But there were some organized land invasions in Peru where a few people with some training actually essentially surveyed the land that they were going to invade. So they set aside the roads and then allocated out the parcels. So the coordination about let's set aside some public space and then we'll have the private space. Sometimes that can even happen in this informal sense amongst this group of activists and poor people who would just seize this land. But even
so you don't need the Russians in Peru.
You don't necessarily need the Russians, but yet I think those roads ended up being very narrow, and what they're going to find is they don't have the kind of flexibility that you have. If you got a few wide roads, in 100 years, you got a few wide roads, you could do something like put a trolley line or
in Toronto's case, this contrasts somewhat with the suburbs immediately around Toronto, which you still have the basic grids, but inside the grids they built cul-de-sac kind of development like you get in Phoenix. And it's become impossible for them, literally, to overlay rapid transit on that. How do you build the density?
Right.
How do you build the density in a cul-de-sac? And if you want to, that's one of the beautiful things about New York is that your grid is actually mostly still here in small little blocks. You can't, I suppose you could expropriate people's houses to turn the cul-de-sac into a road and run a bus down it, but
You know,
in the
as a
real world,
politician,
it's-
it could cost you your job. Take
well,
a few houses.
It's very
and,
unlikely. We had an expropriation issue with our waterfront trail in the east end of Toronto in Scarborough in the south. We took some land that was beside a railway track and put a tunnel under the railway track and added a little bit more land in Lake Ontario and made this amazing linear park. Just amazing. And at the end of it, there were 3 houses, and we wanted to expropriate the end of their gardens so that people could access the water. And so they went from having privileged access, even if it was beside a railway track, to the water, to having access with everybody else. And at the ribbon cutting of the really successful program, the front page story was not about the ribbon cutting, it was about the irate homeowners confronting Mayor David Miller about the expropriation. You know, and I can understand people. I mean, they were having a real loss, but it was for the collective interest. Interestingly, a lot of Toronto's waterfront was expropriated by the mayor in the 1930s. People used to have private beaches, and they were all taken away in the 1930s.
That area to the west, is that near where the big stadium is now?
Yes.
Yeah, because I know that area a little bit, and it really is, it's a shame that there isn't some park space, some public space. I bet even the private landowners now, in retrospect, realize that their land in those buildings would be worth even more if they'd set aside, you know, the public space along the waterfront.
It's an interesting, we actually did finally build a park while I was mayor, but it was supposed to be built in 1972. We built it and opened it in 2008.
But this is in that western part?
Yes.
Or- yeah.
And I mean, it's a fascinating example of failed development because there's a really great arts facility. There's lots of condominiums. There's one place where people work during the daytime, but really it's a bedroom community for downtown. So all the small businesses die. You can't sustain it just having people come out for dinner on Thursday and Friday nights and Saturday nights. So it just hasn't worked. And it's not of the scale of, you know, how do you solve the problem in Peru of people coming into informal settlements. But on a micro scale, it just failed. And if they built the green space and ensured that it wasn't all one type of development, it would have succeeded like it is on the eastern side.
Another city where I've spent much of my life was Chicago. And Chicago, because of, I take it because of the architect Daniel Burnham, who laid out the Burnham plan, managed to save.
Make no little plans, he says.
Managed to save enough of the lakefront so that there's this just terrific lakefront experience all up and down the.
But Chicago had to be burnt down to do that, and that's, you know, if you're running for mayor, you can't say let's completely demolish our city and start over again. It's
Well,
not,
actually,
you know,
I thought that maybe the fire helped get some of that lakefront, but I think they did set aside some of the parks even from Burnham's time.
it had always been a principle, but the fire gave them the political will not to surrender it.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, even today there's controversy about parts, I think, of Millennium Park because it was seen as, you know, somehow losing the principle that it's all for the people, all for free.
Yeah.
And Burnham plan was 1860.
I don't know. I'll bet somebody in the room knows. But,
Jerry? President of a great university should know what a Burnham plan meant.
Maybe it'll come up in the questions. You know, the other story about Chicago, which I like, which must make you jealous as a mayor, was that there was a small airport, Meigs Field, out on the waterfront. And Richie Daley decided, you know, it was just like a few rich people who would fly in and out of the Meigs Field. If you're an executive in downtown Chicago, it was cool to bring your jet in, and you had quick access to downtown. And it was either land that was owned by the federal government, by the FAA, or had been was still under the ownership of the city.
Chicago owned it and leased it.
Leased it, okay. But apparently Daley just went out there with bulldozers one night and tore up the runway and put big X's up and just basically seized like this invasion in Peru. You know, Daley invaded the airport and just said, "There's no more airport here." And then I guess the feds just acquiesced, and so it became part of the park system.
There's a great. First of all, he was right in saying that this public land, that's the most desirable public land in the city, should be for a public park, not for the use of, you know, a tiny fraction of people who could afford to fly, let alone private planes. and we had an analogous issue in Toronto. I'll talk about
So is that, I'll come back to that, yeah.
in a second, but there's a great mayor of Curitiba whose name's Jaime Lerner. And Jaime Lerner is famous for two things. He brought in bus rapid transit to Curitiba. So it's the model for the developing world. You take lanes out of the middle of roads and run buses that have stops that are almost subway stop distance apart. High capacity, very inexpensive. Great model, even a great model, frankly, for developed cities in certain parts of them.
Yeah, and we had, for people who were here before, we had Enrique Peñalos talking about his BRT thing. In
so Enrique's done a lot of work as well on this.
Yeah.
Came from Jaime Lerner, and even in the suburbs outside Toronto, BRTs would be a great transportation solution. It's one thing he's famous for. The other thing is he turned downtown, he pedestrianized it. And so I was at an event, he came to speak in Toronto, and there were questions, and I asked the first question, and I'd just been mayor for a year, and I said, I'm amazed at your pedestrianization. I'm not sure we could get that through here. The consultation with business owners, people would fight about losing parking. I said, how'd you do it? And he said, the businesses closed at 5 one night, and by the next morning the road was gone. It's unbelievable. Now, I live in a more democratic environment than that, although apparently Chicago has a different approach. But, so in Toronto, we have this island airport that was still a big issue. There's a beautiful island off Toronto, if those of you know it. It's
I think you
can see it. Go if you go back.
Actually, just here at the
so
bottom.
There's the airport.
Right at the bottom of the map.
That airport is located where Babe Ruth hit his first professional home run. Okay, it was built. My understanding is it was built temporarily to train Norwegian pilots in the run-up to World War II.
Oh, so it's all fill?
Yeah, and we have. Well, no, it's not fill. It's sandbank. It's a big sandbank. The island. And there is some fill. Parts of it are fill, parts of the airport, but it's mostly sandbank. And we have a great relationship with Norway, but their pilots haven't been in Toronto in 50 years. And it's become a commercial airport. And my view of it was that we shouldn't be expanding the airport. It was a use that was consistent when all of this area here was industry. And now it's not. There 20,000 people live walking distance from the airport. And as you can see, there's not nearly enough green space to accommodate what is a big town down there. And I felt pretty strongly, and I ran on it, that we shouldn't be expanding. We should stop the expansion, and then over time, the airport should sort of fade away. I won the battle but lost the war. We stopped the expansion, but which was going to be facilitated by a bridge. But it's slowly over time, they're starting to bring commercial air transport back. But anyway, at the time, everybody was saying, why don't you just do what Richard Daley did and bring in the bulldozers? And my answer was, I don't want to be in jail.
Right.
In Canada, we don't do this kind of thing.
Yeah,
we're Canadians. We follow the rules.
Right. It does bring up this common point, though, about how many private actors end up with a sense of entitlement to public space, that somehow they own it because either they're close to it or they've used it in some way. So Enrique was talking about this problem where people with cars thought they were entitled to park on the sidewalks, and that when he put the bollards up and said, no, we're not going to park any cars on sidewalks, people were furious at him. And in New York, you see this when people who live near the parts of the street that are now trying to be being designated as bike lanes, they feel like this is somehow an intrusion on their ability to use their streets. And Enrique was saying how important it is as a government to keep reminding everyone that the public space belongs to the public. It belongs to everybody, and it can't be kind of quasi-privatized by the people who live nearby.
Well, there's a couple things on that. There's a new magazine in Toronto, which people, if they're interested in these issues, might want to look at online. It's called Spacing Magazine. It's all about public space, and it's run by these young entrepreneurial people who just believed in the value of public space. And the second thing is there's a democratic issue there. And I was joking about Jaime Lerner just doing things. I think when you see these arguments, sometimes there's a democratic deficit because the value to the general public far exceeds the little private. And you've got to respect people's private use, but if you're able to have a proper democratic dialogue, I think you can sort these things out. And often it doesn't happen that way. It's the person who's losing something versus the mayor. And it shouldn't be that way. And I think it's hard sometimes in city government, particularly when you're a mayor, because you're the focus of attention. But you should really be able to try and bring people together to have a concrete discussion, because we can all, and I didn't mean a discussion about concrete there, that was a poor choice of words. But I think we can all understand, what's the public interest, and at least have a discussion about it. Maybe there's some legitimate points, not so much about parking on the sidewalk, but perhaps there is some rights being restricted by this bike lane here. And how, okay, we need the bike lane, but how are we going to fix that? And sometimes in the rush to do things, you miss that, and you can have decisions that aren't as smart. And it goes counter to the example of Richard Daley and I think what he did was fantastic and very brave. But I do think you end up with more robust results, and I've got confidence in people. I think people are able to make educated, smart decisions. And I'll give you a political example, which isn't much to do with our discussion. But my second term for mayor, there were certain things I wanted to do that required money, and I was running for mayor to do those things. And the city had a financial problem for historic reasons. The provincial government had changed its relationship. We called it downloading, but it had given the city services to do without money. You call it unfunded mandates here. So the city was probably structurally close to insolvent. And so I ran my second term, against the conventional wisdom, which is you can't talk about taxes. And I ran saying, look, we need to build a great city. So in order to do that, we have to increase taxes and create whole new ones. And I give you my word, if you elect me, I'll do that. I'll increase taxes and I'll create whole new ones. And I got 60% of the vote. Right? People were actually prepared to have an educated and sophisticated conversation about it when you engaged them. Yeah. And I think there's this myth that people aren't very smart. They are. And they know their neighborhoods and they know their city, but often they're too busy to be part of the conversation. And if you find a way to get them in the conversation, you can talk about these kinds of concepts, and you'll be amazed at what the answers you'll get from people will be.
When I look around at city governance, one interesting dimension is this issue of electoral accountability. So, for example, there's the Governor General in Hong Kong, who's not accountable at all to the local electorate, versus, say, a mayor like Daley. There's a separate dimension, which is to what extent is power divided between an executive and something like a legislature or council, which is also accountable. And there's a trend, at least discussion about a trend towards the strong mayor and a shift towards, even accepting that the mayor still has to win the elections, a shift towards putting more power in the hands of an executive rather than a legislative-like body. Do you have any, based on your experience, any views about whether that might be a good trend to pursue or not?
Well, it's unbelievable how much comes to you because you are in that position. I don't mean brilliant ideas, I mean facts. And if, when you're in a leadership position like that, particularly at the helm of the city, if you work hard and do your job, you literally know everything that's going on. Not because you're smart, because that's the nature of your position. Everything crosses your desk. And so you have a real understanding that nobody else possibly can have, because they're not sitting at your desk, of all the different trends and currents that need somehow to be balanced. So there's something really significant in that our democratic election system has to give some credit to. Toronto had a weak mayor system, but I did everything I could to make myself the strongest mayor I could be, legally, not, but just by pushing the envelope, because I recognize that these things come across your desk.
This is very close to my intuition about the problem with the legislatures, that the executive just recognizes that everything has to add up in some way, that you take something here, something else has to give, and you end up being forced to think through and address all of the trade-offs that make these decisions so hard. In a legislative body or a big committee, everybody can adopt the mentality that I want this, and it's somebody else's problem to figure out what gives. Like, if I get this, something else won't have, somebody else won't get something else will have to adjust, but that's somebody else's problem. So that the legislatures are inherently focused on one narrow interest, and they can't do the trade-offs about if we have this, we can't have that as well.
Well, so if you looked at the U.S. Congress, you might say that's the case.
That's maybe,
Perhaps it'd be different if there were different people elected.
Yeah.
I didn't find that in Toronto City Council sometimes, and the challenge is in our system, people are elected geographically, neighborhood-based, they're like districts. They're called wards.
Yep.
So people are elected because of what they do on local issues, not because of what they do on citywide issues. So there's a bit of a tension there. My view, because I was the mayor, was I should get my way on the citywide issues as long as I was being consistent with my mandate and what I committed to the people of Toronto. But any mayor is going to think that. I think the legislative side of the system doesn't work too badly if you've got some strengths of the mayor's office, but you need the check and balance of the legislature. And there's a bit of a wisdom of crowds thing. It's not perfect, but I found that side worked reasonably well. I think the thing that doesn't work too well in Canada, and this is a place where I tried to take a stronger role than the legislation perhaps permitted, is the oversight of the civil service. Because when I was elected, I think 12 different people reported to City Council directly. And there was a huge corruption scandal. And one of the reasons was when 12 people report to 45 people, nobody's reporting to anybody. And so there was no accountability. Who is implementing the official plan? Right? Is the Economic Development Department doing its job to bring jobs? Is the Social Development Department doing its jobs to ensure that people who have the least are getting some of those jobs? And I changed the system. I took this to council, but the whole civil service reported through one city manager who reported to me and then to council. And that side of things is really important. You can get good legislation, but one of the things I learned as mayor, unless you're really on top of the people who are implementing it, nothing's going to happen. Yeah. And that requires some real accountability. And I think that kind of accountability is as significant as the legislative kind.
Yeah. I mean, this is a whole other dimension to the job.
We didn't talk about this on the phone, by the way.
Oh yeah, but it's a great direction to go in, because this job, these executive branch jobs, are partly management jobs, and it can make a huge difference if a big organization is well managed or poorly managed. And so, just defining things like who holds whom accountable can make a huge difference. One of the stories I'm fascinated by is the incredible success of the New York City Police Department in fighting crime in the last couple of decades. And I think this is, to a large extent, the result of better management in a context where it's actually hard to manage a mobile workforce that you don't watch and observe every day.
That's true. There's also, who was the mayor immediately before Giuliani? Was that Dinkins?
Dinkins, yeah.
Dinkins had brought in, and I don't think he gets any credit for this, he'd brought in some social development work that really mattered.
Yeah,
and actually paid dividends.
And you mean in the community-based policing or broader?
Not policing work. Work on anti-crime initiatives through funding youth programs, that kind of thing. And it doesn't get mentioned in the narrative. People look because the results started to show under Giuliani, and I think his policing initiatives did make a big difference in what you're talking about. But those other things were part of it.
By the way, I mean, Bratton, who was brought in under Giuliani, does credit Dinkins with having taken the steps that led to addressing one of these problems that just upset everybody, the squeegee men who would stop the cars. That when the squeegee men went away, that was apparently a result of a Dinkins initiative. But Giuliani, I think, gets credit.
They went to Toronto, so he's not as popular.
Another issue that's related to just management is the talent of the people you get and the talent development system that you have. So we have parts of the U.S. government, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, where the compensation is so low, people only go there so that they can get some experience, which they'll take to the private sector. So you get this turnover with no institutional memory.
Yeah.
And if you contrast, say, the U.S. with Singapore, where a civil servant who gets to the top of the hierarchy spends their whole career there, in Singapore can end up getting a salary of $1 million to $1.5 million US per year. And
are they hiring?
Well, you got to work your way up through the system, but if you get to the top, And so they can retain incredibly good people in their management system, and city management's a pretty difficult and challenging job, but everywhere else we seem to just so drastically underpay government employees.
Well, I think it's a question of, how do you value public service? And I don't just mean the salaries. Is public service deemed in your society to be a valuable profession? And I think in Canada's case, that was true 30 years ago. It's becoming less true. It's been devalued.
Yeah.
And I think it's very sad. And there's even some internal issues. The City of Toronto's budget for training its employees, this is in a corporation with a budget, capital and operating of over $10 billion. Its budget for training its employees.
Yeah.
And that was a political battle that even I'm quite progressive and pro-public service. It was something I didn't have the time and energy to get into because I had to win all these other battles first. And the police have a big budget to train their employees. And it's, you want people, when they say to their friends, I'm a public servant, their friends to say, that's great.
Yeah.
And that isn't always the case. And part of that's about the way media treats it, all sorts of historic things. And my friend Howard Moscow was a city councillor for a very long time, was very charismatic, prone to hyperbole. When we debated civil servant salaries, he'd always say, if you want a monkey, pay peanuts. Right? And he's right. And I think we've got a great civil service in Toronto. But discussing politicians' pay or the civil service salary is not usually the lead item in an election or on the evening news, except to say it's bad. And I think it's something that people can understand and grapple with if put to them properly. And I think it's a real loss to society that the value of these institutions has diminished. Doesn't mean you have to have big government. I mean, the U.S. is a small government country. I'm not sure I always agree with the direction, but fine. But you still should be good government. And the Canadian Constitution, your Constitution speaks about, individual rights. Ours says peace, order, and good government. That's right in the Constitution. That's how important the value is to us.
Yeah. Well, my view is that finance is an activity that's done much more harm than nuclear power with all the accidents we've had so far, and that it would be worthwhile for us to spend a little bit more money on regulating finance so it doesn't blow up every so often. So if we paid a little bit more and had a few people who stayed for a little bit longer in places like the SEC in Washington, we'd all be better off.
The difference with me is I apply that to sewage oversight as well.
Do we have some questions from the audience?
I've seen lots of forums where you have written questions on cards. Yeah. I've never seen these neat little baskets. Yeah. I'm very impressed with Stern.
So do you want to? I don't have to screen all these, but let's see. Has Toronto really invested in sustainable development?
Yes.
And have any of those initiatives been embraced popularly, politically, and have they paid off?
Yeah, it's a lengthy answer, and I apologize, but sustainability was an important priority for me, partly because of personal reasons. I grew up in a small village in England and emigrated to Canada, and our village, in hindsight, we didn't use this language at the time, but it was operated on sustainable principles. First of all, people were too poor to throw anything away. You found a way to reuse it. Everybody had a compost heap. It was a farming village. There was an egg farm across the street, Parker's Egg Farm. On this side, there was a dairy. It was just how it went down the street. They made sugar beets. It's not much of a diet, milk, eggs, and sugar beets, but that's sort of the English diet. But I think it really became just a value for me since birth. So it was a big part of my mayoralty, and people embraced it. And we had a climate change strategy. And by the way, Paul knows this because I've said it to him about 50 times, but I really believe that if we focus on cities, we can actually make massive strides on climate change. And it's very sad that national governments aren't acting. We need to act now. We've seen the results with things like Hurricane Sandy. Sea levels rise, and they are, because the Arctic ice melting. You're going to get, storms will create much more damage. And the good news is cities are really acting. So in Toronto's case, we had a climate change strategy, passed City Council unanimously. And our council was quite fractured. We quite famously once took so long to debate when to break for lunch that lunch was over by the time we finished the debate. So, that sort of fractious group came up with a unanimous strategy, and this wasn't just boilerplate. It involved spending billions of dollars on things like public transit, on redoing water infrastructure to use natural systems, on doing energy retrofits in buildings. So it had goals and timetables and massive actions. And for it to pass unanimously, I think shows that people are engaged, because it wouldn't have. It just wouldn't have. Councillors were getting calls from their constituents saying, you got to vote for that. And when I went out in the community and we did environmental initiatives, people come up to me all the time, like hundreds and hundreds of people, saying, what can I do? What can I do? So one of the things we did was create a program that actually went out to neighborhoods and worked with people. We call it Live Green Toronto, but we hired people to go into neighborhoods. It was oriented to lower income neighborhoods first, and it had small grants. So if you wanted to put community scale solar, you could do that. If you wanted to build some allotment gardens, if you want to take private green space that wasn't being used, somehow turn it into a public park, you get a small grant to work on a plan. And that was, the uptake on that was incredible. People absolutely loved it.
And there's a related question here. To what extent did you have assistance from the provincial and national governments? In this case, it was combating urban sprawl, but one could equally well say on addressing sustainability.
So the provincial government's responsible for overall land use. I'd say in the province, we're responsible for land use in the city. I'd say for the 25 years between 1975 and 2000, the province was of absolutely no assistance whatsoever and facilitated urban sprawl because the argument that was being made to them was economically we needed to grow and people wanted to live in houses. So we had to pave over farmland, the best farmland in North America, and turn it into houses. The current government took a different approach and set a green belt outside Toronto in an area called the Oak Ridges Moraine, which is very important from water perspective. If you think of it as a big sponge, it's where rainfall falls and gets cleaned and then ends up in the aquifer. And if that had been paved over, the aquifer would have been severely damaged and wouldn't replenish. So they set a green belt there and then created something called the Places to Grow Act, which said you have to grow inside the green belt. Now, we wanted to anyway, but it supported our direction. Some of the areas outside Toronto didn't want to grow densely. They wanted to stay suburban, but it forced them to grow more densely. On other issues, historically in Canada, the federal government has not been a huge supporter of cities. So while I was mayor, we organized a coalition of mayors to get investment into cities, and we were really successful. And we were smart about what we did. We didn't speak too much, but when we spoke, we had the same message. You can overcome your climate change challenges. You can help resettle immigrants. You can create jobs if you invest in cities. And we were really successful. It was called the New Deal for Cities, but it involved investing billions in Toronto alone. And that took some smart politics. And it was the right thing to do because 80% of the people live in cities. So if the national government wants to succeed, the cities have to succeed. It shouldn't be either or.
So by the way, did you take measures like rezoning, upzoning to try and increase the density of the city? So if you're partly trying to limit the sprawl, was there a conscious move towards greater density increases? If
you go back to the official plan, so that the area downtown, sort of orangey area, basically anything goes. So on Bay Street, Main Street downtown, Four Seasons Hotels, which is a Canadian hotel chain, wanted to build a new hotel. It was about 60 stories, which was way over the existing zoning. And they came in to see me about it. And I said, my personal view is I don't care about the height. You're in a place that's tall buildings. It's once you're over 20 or 30 stories, it's no difference. But I really care about how it relates to the street. I really care about how it relates to the park next door, what amenities you're going to give back to us, and I really care about the jobs. And I don't have the legal authority to negotiate an agreement with them, but what they said was they're going to keep their head office in Canada, they're going to do these architectural and urban design things. And it got through council on that basis. And it's a huge success. So there, anything goes. Some of the white areas, which are single family home neighborhoods, we're fairly restrictive. As of right, you can have an apartment in a house, so that adds a lot of density, but you couldn't put a 30-story building there. But on the brown lines, pretty easily you can get 12 to 15-story mid-rise development, basically as of right. So it's a long way of saying yes.
Yeah, okay. By the way, I also just learned about this new micro apartments kind of contest that the city ran here. Do you know about this, where they had a plot that was empty, and so they ran a competition for people to design apartments that were under 400 square feet, so that you could get a lot of apartments for either a single person or perhaps a couple on a very small piece of land. And the building they built they accepted the design for it's a 10-story building, but has 55 units, a lot of common space for people there. But it's just an interesting example of the different paths one can use to go forward to increase density in the city, and also just adjust to the patterns of living. A lot more people live alone now in these cities.
But if you do that, there's a couple of things you got to do. You got to have great transit.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And because you can't have all that density and put people on roads, it just doesn't work. You also have to find a way to build great parks, because you have to have public space for people to interact publicly.
Yeah.
And they don't always have to be huge ones. Some of the stuff that's done on Broadway, I think is brilliant. All of a sudden I'm walking up Broadway, there's a cafe. There were people out today in the snow having a coffee.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought, you probably want to pour the coffee on your head to stay warm, but but if you don't do that at the same time, you don't have a community, because you've sort of got a vertical walled community. So you have to be extremely careful. But we were very, very supportive of it. The end of my time as mayor, we had over 100 cranes in the sky in Toronto. It was 2010. And I was told by American developers there weren't 100 cranes in the US at the time. And it's because of this policy. We were also, in Canada, you're allowed to charge what are called development charges, so they're payment for infrastructure. We were very cautious with ours. We didn't charge huge development charges because they were a barrier to the construction. What we did instead was we taxed the sale of the apartments. We had a land transfer tax. And I think economically that's much more efficient. We got a huge amount of revenue from it. It balances the city's books, but it didn't discourage development. And we brought in a bunch of policies that supported this kind of goal.
Yeah. So if this goes forward, the idea is that you'll have dense development along these brown lines, not just commercial, industrial, but also dense residential.
Yeah, dense residential and commercial.
Yeah.
Live walk neighborhoods. And those are fairly spread out neighborhoods, so it'll tend to be mid-rise construction, not high-rise. Won't look like Manhattan, we're not.
Sure.
Downtown, well, more.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Here's another
Isn't
question.
there one for you?
Oh, I don't know. This one's not for me because I don't know what the Rogers Center is. But the construction of the Rogers Center was handled by a public-private partnership. Do you feel this financing method has had higher costs or benefits for Toronto as opposed to wholly public or wholly private?
The Rogers Center was originally called the Sky Dome, and for those who don't know, it's quite famously the biggest public spending boondoggle in the history of Canada.
So is that the baseball stadium?
Yeah.
Or, oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's
Oh,
a
I know.
brilliant stadium,
Yeah.
brilliant architecture that when the roof moves, it's incredible. Yeah. But it started out as a proposal to build a multi-purpose stadium for, I think, $135 million. Whoever asked the question probably knows, and it ended up costing $650 million. For one of the reasons was it was sort of not in anybody's direct control. There was no accountability. It was this unusual public-private model where the private partners were able to change the design at will. So they put a hotel in the middle of it halfway through and had to redesign the whole stadium. I mean, it was crazy, out of control stuff.
Who ended up bearing the cost of the overrun? Was it mostly public?
Yeah. So my personal view is the traditional method of procurement where governments, engineers say, here's our design, and then you go out and get a tender that's open and transparent, it's open in public, and you add to it something like cost certainty, so there's a bonus if they come in within cost. I think that's proven to be the most cost-effective method. What happened with the dome is just wrong. And interestingly, everybody involved who was elected lost, except one guy was appointed at the time. The chairman of the region was appointed, and he's now running the Ontario Lottery Corporation in Canada. So he survived because he wasn't elected. Everybody else was defeated at the time.
Yeah, but
Great stadium.
Yeah, but this is actually a warning. I think it has general applicability that if in a sense, the government of Toronto, which is around the world, has to be one of the most sophisticated, can basically get taken to the cleaners with one of these PPPs. Think about what happens in these developing countries that are desperate for infrastructure, agree to some PPP deal, and then there's a way to sort of readjust it, renegotiate it, rechange it from the inside, and you just repeatedly see countries getting taken advantage of with these.
Well, I mean, the challenge, a traditional procurement's fairly simple because at least in the common law world, the law is very settled on this. Mm-hmm. A public-private partnership, if you're building something like a new subway, the law is not fully settled, and it's all about negotiating transfer of risk. Mm-hmm. That's a really sophisticated concept, and I think some of it's not real either. But that's not my point. If you're in a developing country and you don't have, state-of-the-art advisors from Wall Street or from the City of London, mm-hmm. You can't possibly negotiate. Yeah. But if you take this traditional model that there's been 100 years of law on, you're much more likely to have somebody who can negotiate a reasonable outcome.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've spoken frequently about how we'll need mechanisms to direct investment and financial resources from the rich countries that face this investment dearth right now to the developing countries that have these enormous investment return opportunities because of urbanization. But we're going to need vehicles that protect the investors, but also protect the citizens in these developing countries. And the PPP structure, which a lot of people are enthusiastic about, I think has got a very mixed track record at best, and we'll need some other structures to make sure that investment takes place.
Well, my friend Howard Moscow, I'm going to probably quote him 3 times tonight, he called them public-pirate partnerships. But there's something else the developing world needs on these issues, and there has to be an environmental overlay to the thinking about future infrastructure. And it goes back to your point, that grid was, whatever it was, 1811. Mm-hmm. As we're helping people, as the World Bank in particular is helping people, they really need to think through, are we building a 19th century infrastructure or a 22nd century infrastructure? Mm-hmm. And my analogy is always cell phones. Mm-hmm. We didn't build a telephone network all over Africa. Lots of places jumped right to cell phones. And what's the cell phone of water infrastructure? What's the cell phone of electricity infrastructure? I mean, should we be building huge coal-fired or even gas-fired plants, or should we be helping them build a smart grid that thinks about conservation first, distributed energy through green technologies, maybe a little more expensive right now, but with some subsidies from the World Bank, it's much likely to be a sustainable sort of grid, much likely to be far more resilient, and that's a huge problem. I mean, that in New York, we know that along the east coast of North America, a fuse blows outside of Cleveland and the power goes out in Toronto because our grid's so connected. And all of the technology to do that isn't there yet, but it'll be there 5 years or 10 years. Some of it's happening in incubators around New York City. So how do we incorporate that thinking and help people make that leap is a really important question. And it's not the easiest thing to do politically.
Yep. Let's see. There's another question here about sea level rise. So, given the threat in the next 100 years, is this being taken seriously enough by city planners, and in particular in cities like Toronto? What's Toronto's plan for what will happen if sea levels go up by a meter or two?
Toronto's challenge is less directly from the sea level rise than from an increasing severity and frequency of storms. Okay. We've had, in the last 5 years, we've had 3 storms that are only supposed to happen every 50 years, caused huge damages, causing us to literally spend $1 billion, and our total tax revenue is about 3. It's a huge amount of money to rebuild infrastructure just to deal with that. So we're starting to grapple with the storms, but it's a complicated and expensive process. Grappling with things like an evacuation. New York did incredibly well. You should be reassured by what Mayor Bloomberg and his officials were able to do. It's really tough. We have a nuclear plant next to Toronto. If something happens there, evacuating 3 million people from there is very, very difficult. And I don't think in terms of other cities and sea level rise, I think people are just starting to scratch the surface. It's awfully difficult. Lower Manhattan, you know, what do you do? You know, the subway this time, they used saran wrap to wrap up the ticket machines. I think brilliant and innovative for quick thinking. Well, if you have 4 storms like Sandy in a year, because the seawater's if it's that much higher, the resulting water is many times more serious. Are you going to be able to do that 3 or 4 times a year? What are you going to do? And I don't think anybody's ready. Now, the good news is our organization, the C40 that I used to chair, Mayor Bloomberg chairs now, has a specific group of cities working on these issues. And they've got cities like Jakarta and cities like Rotterdam. And you know, the Dutch have some self-interest because they've got technologies that they've developed, but they're working on it, and they will come up with some ideas, but they're not there yet.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question. So someone asked, can a city be too dense?
Yes.
Which obviously it can be, but if you think about density, like New York, the mayor has been consciously trying to increase the density here. Toronto, on average, is a lot less dense, I think, than New York. What do you think is the way forward as cities develop around the world? You get a variety of cities that can range from something like Toronto to New York, or is there a intermediate point you think is going to turn out to be more preferred by people?
Well, I mean, what people want changes over time. Mm-hmm. You're seeing a huge influx in many cities around the world now into dense urban areas, particularly in cities like New York, Toronto, and London, where young people, you know, under the age of 30, far less likely to say, I'm 16, I want a car, than my generation was. Yeah.
Somebody here, Michael Moss, told me that the new thing that used to be when we were kids, you know, the first thing to get was a car. Nowadays, it's a smartphone. Kids don't care about cars anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, that's overstating it, but there's some truth to that, right? And if you have a smartphone, you want to be connected. Do you want to be driving, or do you want to be on transit? You know, particularly above ground transit. Hence the LRTs in Toronto. So, I think density's great, but you've got to have. I'll go back to the point I made a couple times ago. You've got to have great parks. You really and public spaces. And public spaces aren't all about parks. They can be hard spaces, but you've really got to think, as you become more and more vertical, how are people going to establish a community and relate to each other? How are you going to have a democratic dialogue? Mm. You know, democratic dialogue is as much, you know, a loud conversation in a bar over a few beers or a quieter one in a coffee shop as it is at City Hall. But that civil society really matters. And the one risk with vertical communities is people don't need to know their neighbors. And you have to find a way to accommodate that. And it's very difficult once your city's already dense. Mm-hmm. It has to be part of the thinking as you're doing it. In Toronto's case, we're hit and miss on this, because when you build density, you're required to contribute to parkland, but you can buy your way out by law. Mm-hmm. So we get a lot of money. Well, try finding new land for parks in that orange area there. Yeah. Right? You know, can you imagine what would happen? The front pages, mayor expropriates a 60-story building to build a tiny little park for, you know, $90 million. Right? It's not going to happen. So you once you've missed the opportunity, you've got some real issues. Yeah.
You know, there must be a huge set of questions to be addressed about what makes a park an attractive, livable, successful space as opposed to this kind of dead area. Just here, if you look at the green space around Silver Towers, where you never see anybody on that green space, and then you go to Washington Square Park, and it's just full of people all the time. Small details in how those parks are designed and how welcoming they feel to people can, I think, make a huge difference in how.
They're experts on that. Yeah. They're underpaid, but they're really good. Yep. I'm not one of them. Yeah. But the details really matter. And it's true, I think, in general in cities. Mm-hmm. Details matter. Mm-hmm. You know, and you go back to the broken windows theory that Mayor Giuliani adopted. Mm-hmm. Well, if you're walking down a city street and it's clean, and there's street life, there's vendors, and you know, it's great. Even if there's people walking by with loud music on their headphones, it's great. It's alive, and it's because of little details, and that's a really important part of city government and the thinking about parks. I think New York does a pretty good job in its parks for a really big area, but it's details. It's always details.
Yeah, one of the things that I have fully taken on board since I moved here to New York is that the public spaces are what matter, and the sidewalks are as important as public spaces as the parks. So it's all the different places where you interact with people. And
absolutely.
So the green space, to be sure, but also these other spaces where we interact with each other.
One of the things, and I don't know the example you gave, but in the 60s and 70s in Canada and the US, we encouraged this tower in a park idea.
Yeah, is this what Silver Towers is?
So it's sort of really semi-private green space. And the modern thinking is that was wrong. You should have buildings facing the street. Maybe you could have a really nice park inside the buildings, but you're much better off to use that green space to create a public park, not private green space. And we see it in Toronto. We have a whole program to address this. Often in neighborhoods where have gotten lower income, there'll be an outdoor pool, for example, because the apartments were originally really nice. Well, now it's surrounded by a rusting chain link fence. It's not used. And if that were part of public green space, it would be a completely different experience. And that is part of the issue. This, who owns, who controls.
I think one of the interesting opportunities for New York is to try and redevelop its riverfront. It's in a position a little bit like Toronto, where it neglected the waterfront initially, and there'll be room to do a better job with.
Some stuff's happening.
Yeah.
Right? I think the question for New York is, how do you bring people of low and modest income to the waterfront and not just let it become, because the development pays for itself if you have really high-end condos, right?
Yeah.
And I know there's rules here, and I think they're doing a commendable job trying to do it. But that's a challenge, because from my perspective, the more neighborhoods you have that are real, that everybody can live in, and you have conversations with each other, and you know each other, the stronger civil society you're going to have.
Yeah. Well, we're all very worried about who the next mayor is going to be. So this is the same question we got for Peñalosa. So what's your next step? Are you busy for the next few years?
I got asked the same question in Los Angeles last week. And it'll be an interesting mayoral campaign. I'm from Toronto, and I'm here to help you. Might be more popular in New York than other parts of Canada. I can certainly attest that.
Yeah. Well, I'll say one last thing about Toronto. When my kids were very small, one of their grandparents, two of their grandparents were in Toronto, so we used to go out on North Lawrence, and they absolutely loved Toronto because there were the electric buses with the overhead lines, and little kids love different transit systems, and so they were just ecstatic about being able to go ride the electric buses. I have a feeling those have all been phased out, but
they unfortunately were. Unwisely, in my view, it was before I was elected. But when they come back, they'll be able to ride on brand new European LRTs down the middle of the street, and they're even better than electric buses.
I now can. I'll bring my grandchildren, and we'll come try the LRTs when they're running.
Great.
Good. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Paul. Pleasure. Thank you.